To confront such weaponization and religious persecution, today I'm signing an executive order to make our Attorney General, who's a great person, she's going to be a great Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the head of a task force, brand new, to eradicate anti-Christian bias. About time, right? Anti-Christian bias. Yeah, you never heard of that one before, right? But it's about time, isn't it though, really?
Hey Trump, your Majesty, the reason that nobody has heard of anti-Christian bias within the US government is because it doesn't exist.
So many times you hear, but you don't hear the anti-Christian bias. The mission of this task force will be to immediately halt all forms of anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within the federal government, including at the DOJ, which was absolutely terrible, the IRS, the FBI, terrible, and other agencies.
We're seriously living in wild times. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor, and on this channel we talk about life and relationships after leaving the church, and we do some commentary on the goings-on in evangelical Christianity. A few weeks ago, President Trump announced via an executive order the formation of an anti-Christian task force headed by Attorney General Pam Bondi. According to the executive order, the task force mission is to protect the religious freedoms of Americans and end the anti-Christian weaponization of government. Suppose you've paid even a little bit of attention to American politics. In that case, you're probably wondering how exactly our government has been weaponized against Christians. After all, Christianity is the dominant religion in the US, and most politicians are Christian. Conservative lobbying organizations furthering the agenda of the Christian right, such as the Heritage Foundation, are massively influential in US politics. Since the 80s, conservative administrations have followed the policy guidance of the Heritage Foundation to a T, and their Project 2025 is currently a blueprint for Trump's administration. So, where exactly is the anti-Christian bias in all of this? Well, in the executive order, Trump's administration provides us with a handful of examples of supposed anti-Christian bias within the government. During a prayer breakfast for a private religious group, Trump even spoke about one particular instance in which he claimed an elderly Christian woman was wrongfully arrested.
Religion, what they've done, and the persecution that they've executed have been just horrible. For example, most of us would not have believed it possible that a grandmother with a severe medical condition, quite elderly woman, would be put in jail for praying here in America. She was put in jail because she was praying. But we're joined today by a woman who was 75 years old. Paulette Harlow was sentenced to 2 years in prison for peacefully praying outside of a clinic, charged under an obscure law that hadn't been used in years, selectively weaponized against Christians by the previous administration.
If the situation played out as Trump described and this woman was arrested for simply praying outside of a clinic, then yeah, this would be an example of anti-Christian bias. There's no law against praying. But surprise, surprise, this isn't how the situation actually played out. Back in October 2020, 9 anti-abortion protesters, including the grandmother Trump mentioned, forcibly entered a reproductive health care clinic in Washington, D.C. While inside, they formed a line and linked themselves together using chains, ropes, and furniture, preventing patients from entering and receiving care. Amid the chaos, one of the clinic's nurses sprained her ankle after being pushed, and one patient was reportedly accosted by the protesters while experiencing labor pains. Later on, police found 5 human fetuses in the home of the protesters' leader, Lauren Handy. I really don't want to know what she planned on doing with those. Collecting fetuses like you'd collect stamps is some kind of bizarre hobby. Turns out that blocking people from entering a healthcare facility, causing injury to a nurse, harassing someone who's in active labor, and hoarding human tissue is against the law. Handy was sentenced to 5 years in prison for leading and directing the group, and Paulette Harlow, the grandmother, was sentenced to 24 months for her involvement in the altercation. As one of his first acts following his inauguration, Trump announced he was pardoning everyone involved in this situation. He claimed they were just peacefully protesting and were targeted for prosecution because of their religious beliefs. Obviously, Trump is blatantly lying. This isn't a case of Christian persecution, but claiming so sets the stage for future Christian zealots to force their religious beliefs onto others, even when it endangers people's lives, under the guise of religious freedom. Believing you have the God-given right to harm those who don't share your religious convictions is the epitome of narcissism. Now, I understand the word narcissism carries with it certain connotations, so allow me to explain. I define evangelical narcissism as the attitude and actions that result from believing Christianity is superior to other religions, and that only those belonging to the evangelical sect of Christianity should hold positions of power. I'm not using this word to pathologize or diagnose individual people, but rather to describe how beliefs about Christian supremacy cause even otherwise selfless people to act in narcissistic ways. I think this distinction is important. I believe evangelical narcissism is running rampant in the US right now, and Trump's anti-Christian task force is a prime example of this. So in today's video, I'd like us to go through the executive order that outlines this task force to explore how Trump and the Christian right are rewriting narratives to feed this narcissism. Before we jump in, allow me a brief moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Aura. These days, it's easier than ever to find information online that most would prefer to keep private. Recently, it was reported that hackers stole over 2.9 billion personal records from a brokerage firm called National Public Data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others who perform background checks. These stolen records include full names, addresses, dates of birth, social security numbers, and phone numbers, along with alternate names and birth dates. And members of this hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. If you haven't really been taking any precautions with your personal information online, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. It makes me pretty nervous knowing that my data is just floating around out there and that anyone could access my private information, like my social security number, to access things like my bank account or credit cards. Luckily, because I use the sponsor of today's video, Aura, I don't need to worry about this. Aura alerts me if they find my phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They'll let me know fast if anyone tries to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts, and they provide me with $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst happen. They also have a bunch of other features that keep you safe online, all inside one app. You can go to my link, aura.com/antibot, to try out Aura for free for 14 days. That's more than enough time for Aura to find out if your data is exposed. I highly recommend you do this soon because National Public Data isn't doing anything about the leaked records, and they'll probably not face any repercussions. I don't want to be vulnerable to future data breaches, and if you don't want to be either, you can go to aura.com/antibot to try them out for 2 weeks free of charge. Thank you so much, Aura. Now back to the video. As I said earlier, this task force is led by our new Trump-appointed Attorney General, Pam Bondi. The job of a US AG is to represent the country in all legal matters and lead the Department of Justice by overseeing federal prosecution. prosecutions. If you're unfamiliar with her background, Bondi is a lifelong Republican who previously served as Florida's AG from 2011 until 2019. Bondi has a long history of cuddling up to Trump. In 2013, after receiving dozens of fraud complaints, she actually considered joining a lawsuit against Trump University, an unaccredited training program founded by Trump that promised to teach students about real estate, wealth management, and entrepreneurship. In reality, Trump University was a self-help scam akin to the training programs littering the multi-level marketing world. Speaking of which, Trump also has a long history of involvement with MLMs, aka legalized pyramid schemes, in which over 99% of participants lose money. This is a total side note, but did you guys know that the first video I ever posted on this channel was about Trump's history with MLMs? I really cringe rewatching that video because my presentation style was kind of atrocious, but I still think that the information in that video is pretty good. In 2009, Trump partnered with a dietary supplement MLM called Ideal Health, which was later rebranded to the Trump Network. I call this company the PMLM because their whole gimmick was to have customers collect vials of their urine and then ship it to the MLM to be tested. Then the MLM would send them back overpriced supplements supposedly tailored to their body's specific needs. During this time, the US experienced an economic recession, and Trump marketed this MLM as a way for people to recover financially. Yeah, totally gross.
The Trump Network wants to give millions of people renewed hope and with an exciting plan to opt out of the recession. Let's get out of this recession right now. With cutting-edge health and wellness formulas and a system where you can develop your own financial independence, the Trump Network offers people the opportunity to achieve their American dream. I'm still looking for dreams. I'm doing damn well in life, but I'm still looking for the dream. It's a winning combination because it means you and your family can benefit financially from our breakthrough program. Follow our step-by-step success system that will help you grow your business.
Trump also served as a spokesman and promoter of an MLM called ACN for over a decade. He actually only quit when he made his first presidential bid, and he reportedly made millions from working with them. Yeah, Trump made millions, but according to studies, almost everyone who joins an MLM loses money. Without even bringing up his long track record of racism, sexism, and misogyny, his promoting scams like MLMs and running bogus training programs like the Trump Network is enough to conclude that the man just has no moral center whatsoever. Anyway, back to Pam Bondi. Bondi was considering joining the lawsuit against Trump University, but ultimately decided not to after receiving a $25,000 donation towards her political reelection from Trump's foundation. Basically, it looks like Trump bribed her. Years later, in 2019, Trump hired Bondi to help defend him during his first impeachment proceedings. Then, in 2020, Bondi became one of the most vocal supporters of Trump's claims of voter fraud, and she even sought to overturn the election. She has since weaseled her way around questions whenever they're about the 2020 election. Just check out how Bondi responded when asked about voter fraud during her confirmation hearing for her position as AG.
On the day after the 2020 presidential general election, you traveled to Philadelphia to appear alongside President Trump's then attorney, Rudy Giuliani. And together, you falsely asserted that President Trump had, quote, won Pennsylvania in that election. Now, I want to be clear, at that moment, there were still at least 1 million ballots left to be counted in Pennsylvania. Of course, President Biden went on to win the state by more than 80,000 votes. But in the following days, even after the results were clear, you continued to double down on the big lie, promoting falsehoods about election fraud and cheating without offering any actual evidence. And I remember it clearly because I served as California Secretary of State at the time, and I invited anybody associated with the Trump campaign who was making these claims to come forward with evidence of irregularities in the election or massive voter fraud. 4 years later, I still have seen none. So I ask you today, do you have any evidence of election fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election?
So, First Senator.
Yes or no? It's a yes or no question.
First Senator.
Do you have evidence, yes or no?
First Senator. I'm so sorry about the fires to you and Senator Schiff and what you're going through in your states. I have to say that.
I
And
appreciate
think
that.
all
But
of
my
our,
clock is
I'll
ticking,
answer
and I
your
want to
question. All
hear
of our
your answer.
hearts go out to everyone in California for what you're facing right now. I'm glad you asked the question about Pennsylvania.
It's a yes or no question.
I was
Do
hoping
you have evidence,
someone
yes or
would.
no?
Senator, I was hoping you'd ask the question.
Do you have evidence, yes or no?
I traveled to Pennsylvania.
Do you have the evidence,
I
yes
traveled,
or no?
Senator, to Pennsylvania.
Okay. You're not answering my question. If you have no evidence to offer, let me ask you this. Will you now retract your previous statements that Trump won Pennsylvania in the 2020 election, yes or no?
Oh, Senator, I traveled to Pennsylvania, and let me tell you what I saw firsthand.
Yes or
no?
no?
I didn't talk about California because I was not in California. I talked about
Yes or no? Last time I'm going to ask.
I talked about Pennsylvania because
Mr.
I
Chair,
was there.
I'm going to move on because she's
got a
clearly not
court
answering my
order
questions. And
to
I want to know,
observe.
colleagues, for everybody, members of the committee and everybody watching, that the attorney who stood beside Mr. Giuliani was making very similar statements. And he has since been disbarred from multiple jurisdictions for making these false claims about the 2020 election in court. And like Mr. Giuliani, as you've noted today, you've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution just as an attorney. And now you're asking us to consider you to serve as the chief law enforcement officer in our country. So it's imperative, Ms. Bondi, that you subscribe to facts and evidence and not politically convenient conspiracy theories.
Now, as a Trump loyalist willing to lie for her beloved king, Bondi finds herself leading the charge to rid the country of anti-Christian bias. The executive order begins by establishing a legal precedent for protecting religious expression. It says, the founders established a nation in which people are free to practice their faith without fear of discrimination or retaliation by their government. For that reason, the United States Constitution enshrines the fundamental right to religious liberty in the First Amendment. It then goes on to say that later legislative acts like the Restoration Act of 1993 and the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 further prohibit religious discrimination. Americans indeed have a freedom of religion, but what's the point of restating what's already part of American law? Well, the executive order goes on to say that the previous administration, meaning Joe Biden, targeted peaceful Christians while ignoring violent anti-Christian offenses. Trump's administration is accusing Catholic Joe Biden of ignoring the Constitution to discriminate against Christians. This is an outlandish claim considering, according to the National Catholic Reporter, Biden attended Mass regularly while in office, always carried a rosary around in his pocket, and peppered a lot of his speeches with religious references. Trump, on the other hand, has barely attended church, lives a lifestyle that's completely at odds with conservative Christian morals, and he doesn't even know how to pronounce books of the Bible correctly.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17. That's the whole ballgame. Where the Spirit of the Lord, right? Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And here there is Liberty College, but Liberty University. But it is so true.
So how exactly is Trump's administration backing up the idea that Biden discriminated against Christians? Well, by lying, of course. The first example the executive order cites is the prosecution of the anti-abortion protesters in D.C. As we already covered, these protesters were prosecuted for blocking access to a healthcare facility, not for praying. The order then goes on to claim that during Biden's tenure, hundreds of specifically Catholic churches, charities, and pro-life centers were attacked and vandalized, and that Biden's Department of Justice did little to prosecute prognosticate the perpetrators. According to USA Today, while there was a slight increase in crimes involving conservative Christian churches and pro-life centers following the reversal of Roe v. Wade, the majority of these were limited to property vandalism like graffiti or broken windows. The Department of Justice doesn't usually get involved in cases of petty crimes like this. They didn't get involved because it wasn't their job to get involved. That being said, even with the increase, the number of incidents involving churches was still relatively small compared to incidents involving abortion clinics. Despite many clinics closing down, crimes involving abortion clinics also increased following the reversal of Roe v. Wade. The National Abortion Federation documented almost 400 incidents involving abortion clinics in 2022, including 40 assaults, 200 death threats, and 20 invasions into healthcare facilities. Of course, crimes against churches or religious properties should be taken seriously, but the insinuation that Christian buildings are being disproportionately targeted is completely unfounded. The third example the order brings up is a supposed FBI memo that labeled radical traditionalist Catholics as domestic terrorists and called the FBI to infiltrate Catholic churches as threat mitigation. You're probably wondering, what exactly is a radical traditionalist Catholic? According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, a nonprofit specializing in civil rights, Rad-trads, as they're known, are part of a small but extreme movement in Catholicism that upholds tradition and rejects the liberalizing reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Most notably, anti-Semitism is an inextricable part of the Rad-trad ideology, and they hold the entirety of the Jewish people responsible for the death of Jesus. If you're still doubtful as to the extremism of this subset of Catholicism, back in the 2000s, some rad-trad leaders attended explicitly white supremacist events to distribute their materials, some of which included the Protocols of the Elder of Zion, a fabricated text foundational to modern anti-Semitism. More recently, rad-trad leaders went on the media productions of well-known neo-Nazis like Nick Fuentes. And the Southern Poverty Law Center is currently tracking 8 different organizations across the US considered to be rad-trad hate groups. So what exactly is up with this FBI memo about rad-trads, and was the FBI planning on infiltrating Catholic churches? To answer this question, I'm going to read an excerpt from an article about this executive order written by Hemant Mehta, also known as the Friendly Atheist. I actually used his article as a jumping off point while researching for this video, and I highly recommend checking out his work, which I'll have linked below in the description. That memo was never actually released by the FBI. Some employees in a Virginia field office put together an internal document linking violent extremism with radical traditionalist Catholic ideology, and that document was then leaked to right-wing media outlets. When the FBI looked into this, they quickly rescinded the document, saying it failed to adhere to FBI standards and formally admonished the employees involved. Hemant says about the FBI investigation, "When you look at the details, you realize even the initial allegation wasn't stemming from a place of bias. According to the FBI, they began tracking a man who advocated civil war and the assassination of politicians, and then purchased semi-automatic weapons and ammo. He was then arrested for other reasons, but in jail, his online threats grew even worse. Once he was released, there was reason to believe this guy wanted to put his rhetoric into action. That's when the guy began attending a church that's not formally affiliated with the Catholic Church, but pushed traditional Catholic theology and liturgy. He also described himself on social media as fascist and Catholic, and a radical traditional Catholic clerical fascist." Damn, and they have a hard time with pronouns. Even worse, it appeared that he was recruiting members in that church to carry out an attack. The man was then arrested. When the FBI interviewed the church's priest, choir director, and other members, it seemed all of them knew exactly why the FBI wanted to speak to them. It was that guy, wasn't it? They cited his unusual and concerning behavior and racism. Hement goes on to describe how the FBI found 2 other men with similar ideologies who also attended a traditional Catholic church, which prompted the initial document suggesting a link between the 2. However, the document was quickly rescinded. If you think about it, the fact that the document was rescinded actually disproves the claim of anti-Christian bias. If anti-Christian bias was actually present in this situation, the document would have been promulgated without raising concerns, right? As Hement says, this sounds like the government working as it should. What's scarier to me is that twisting this into a case of Catholic persecution normalizes radicalism. This document was never about mainstream Catholics and didn't call for a government infiltration of the Catholic Church. It was about members of an extreme faction with ties to white supremacists who were gearing up to carry out an attack. In my opinion, what Trump's administration is saying with this is that religious extremists, as long as they're Christian extremists, should be allowed to run amok, and that any attempt to stop them means you're persecuting someone for their religious beliefs. Again, how is this anything other than narcissism? The final thing the executive order brings up is several cases in which Biden's administration told religious organizations receiving federal funding that they couldn't discriminate against marginalized communities. For example, if a college received federal funds, it wasn't permitted to have student groups that prohibited LGBT students from joining. If a foster agency received federal funds, they couldn't place children in the homes of those who wouldn't respect the children's pronouns. They didn't even say these discriminatory organizations can't exist at all, but just that they can't receive federal funding. This is not Christian persecution. The funniest thing about this part of the executive order is their claim that Biden tried to turn Easter Sunday into Transgender Day of Visibility. Like everything else in this order, this is an outright lie. While it's true that in 2024, Transgender Day of Visibility coincided with Easter Sunday, this is just happenstance. For over 15 years, long before Biden took office, Transgender Day of Visibility has been on March 31st. Easter Sunday is always the first Sunday after the full moon. So at some point, these days just end up lining up. As Hement mentioned in his article, is Trump really out here trying to say the calendar is persecuting him? Like, be so for real. So to wrap up, not a single example in this order is an actual case of anti-Christian bias, let alone a case of violent anti-Christian offenses like the order claims. Not a single one. What Trump's administration is doing is reframing situations and twisting facts so it looks like their group, evangelicals, are being persecuted when they're not. If you think about it, isn't this what narcissists do? Isn't a common trait of narcissism exaggerated victimhood? Of course, as I said at the beginning of this video, I am not saying that all evangelicals are narcissists. I think we do have good reason to think that Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist, but I don't think that Trump is an evangelical. I actually don't think the guy even believes in God. That being said, what this executive order is doing is training evangelicals to view themselves as victims of anti-Christian bias anytime they don't get their way. This is narcissism in effect. Even though most evangelicals don't intend to claim false victimhood, they're still effectively doing so. What's worse is that this false sense of victimhood comes at the expense of those who are actually victims of marginalization and discrimination, like LGBT folks and ethnic and religious minorities. As Americans United for the Separation of Church and State put it, if Trump really cared about religious freedom and ending religious persecution, he'd be addressing anti-Semitism in his inner circle, anti-Muslim bigotry, hate crimes, crimes against people of color and other religious minorities, but instead he's abolishing federal programs and protections that address those wrongs. This task force is not a response to Christian persecution. It's an attempt to make America into an ultra-conservative Christian nationalist nation. Thank you guys so much for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who help make these videos possible. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my Instagram is Taylor_the_antibot. And if you'd like to consider supporting this channel financially, a link to my Patreon will be down in the description, and we'll see you on the next one. Say bye. Oh, I'm sorry.